Eschatology class. We're discussing our Rapture Theories this morning, and this is a very fun topic. It can be a very contentious topic, and our goal here this morning is really to give an overview and explain kind of what they are, but not necessarily defend and get into all the particulars of why one is right and one is wrong. I certainly have an opinion about what I think is best, but I am referring to these as theories. I think that all of these theories are very well reasoned and well argued. I think all of these theories are very well reasoned and well argued, and I think that the people that are teaching them and presenting them are very sincere, and they have put their hope in Jesus, and I think that's why they're passionate about this topic. But that being said, this is one of the most passionate topics out there, and people can get very upset about these things, and this is why a lot of teachers tend to kind of gloss over this one or avoid it sometimes because they just don't want to get into the argument. And so the challenge this morning is to go through and take a look at this whole topic, explain the different viewpoints, and come out of it more educated, more equipped to continue to look at this on your own and come to your own conclusions, okay? But how we've been building this class, starting with interpretation methods and the covenants and the different theological systems, we're going to carry all of that into what we're talking about this morning, okay? And so what I'd like to do is just start with an overview. It took 5 weeks to get a timeline on the board. Is that amazing? Yeah, normally we start with this, right? How many timelines have you guys seen on the internet about the end times, right? I mean, some of these things are just, it must have taken them years to put these things together, right? This one's pretty simple. It took me a couple minutes. There's a lot of things I'm leaving out here because a lot of the factors that we're going to look at today get placed in different spots according to what system you follow. But there are some that are pretty solidified, so I went ahead and put them up here, okay? So the issues on our timeline that we're going to see this morning are the 7-year covenant, okay? So here's the cross, here we are in the New Testament era, and then what we're looking at is a period of time called Daniel's 70th week. And so if you look at Daniel 9, verse 27 in particular, it really lays out this 7th week of 7 years, and talks about the Abomination of Desolation, this covenant that's made, and this is where we get a lot of that information. And so we have this 7-year period that we're really focusing on. This is often referred to as a tribulation period, okay? But it starts with a covenant, and it's a covenant made by the Antichrist with God's people, or with Daniel's people. So we've traditionally interpreted this as the Antichrist is going to make some sort of a covenant with Israel. Okay, it's interesting that this word is used, right? And if you look at what's going on in the Middle East today, what are they calling these peace agreements between Israel and the Arab nations that have been traditionally hostile towards them? Calling them the Abraham Accords, right? Okay, and so if you look at the language of Daniel 9:27, sometimes it's interpreted, we'll make a strong covenant. It really means to solidify or to confirm a covenant is the language there. And so the reality is that Israel is claiming their right to that land, right? That's the issue that we've been dealing with because of the Abrahamic covenant. He promised them that land from the Euphrates River all the way down to the Brook of Egypt, and then way out into like Jordan and Iraq. That's the actual physical promised land. And so what it looks like is the Antichrist confirming the Abrahamic covenant to some regard with Israel over their right to be in the land. Right now, nobody wants to acknowledge their right to exist or live in Jerusalem in particular, but we are seeing these peace treaties pop up. So maybe that's a precursor, maybe there's more to that. I'm not going to really draw any solid conclusions, but that's kind of the idea we're working with. But halfway through the week, at the 3.5-year mark, we have what's referred to as the Abomination of Desolation. And this is where the Antichrist appears in Jerusalem. He comes in and everything's peaceful, and everybody thinks everything's great, but then he goes into the temple, he desecrates the temple, he proclaims himself to be God. This is how Paul interpreted it for us in Thessalonians. And then he's going to basically break the covenant with Israel at that point. And his army's going to invade and attack. Okay? And so what we have in the middle of that week is the beginning of a 3.5-year period, or 1,260 days, or time times and half a time, as it's repeated, known as the time of Jacob's trouble. That's an Old Testament phrase out of Jeremiah. But it's also referred to as the Great Tribulation, in particular this last 3.5 years, or 42 months. It's just reiterated in all sorts of ways so that I think that we don't mess this one up as far as the timeline goes, okay? And so in this period of this last 3.5 years, a lot of things are going to happen. And we have the modern state of Israel, which we kind of think is indestructible, right? They're going to be overthrown. The modern state of Israel is going to fall. The Great Apostasy, that's another factor. Paul says, in talking about the day of the Lord in particular, he says that the day of the Lord won't come until the Antichrist is revealed when he desecrates the temple, which, by the way, means that there needs to be a temple in Jerusalem again, which there isn't currently. And the Great Apostasy, or the Great Falling Away. And this is the idea of people who believe the truth, when the persecution comes, are going to fall away or be deceived. There's several elements to that. The other issue is Elijah. It says, before the great day of the Lord, Elijah will come. It's the prophecy out of Malachi. We'll talk about that a little more. And then also the sun is darkened, the moon turns to blood, and the stars fall from the sky. And there's these great celestial disturbances at the very end before Jesus returns on the clouds. And then, after Jesus returns, we have the great battle of Armageddon, which is really for Jerusalem, right? Jesus, this whole thing about the covenant and this whole battle between God and Satan, the forces of good and the forces of evil, all center around Jerusalem. And the reason that Jerusalem is pinpointed is because that's the place where Jesus is going to establish his throne, right? And if you look at Jerusalem today, Satan is the ruler of this world right now, right? And he's got control of the nations. The Lord is redeeming people out of all of these nations, but by and large, Satan is the ruler of this world. And one of his big exclamation points, one of his big it is the fact that in the place of that temple and the place of that throne is a mosque, right? And it's kind of Satan's way of saying, look, I got it, and you can't have it, right? And that's why that little piece of property, the Temple Mount, is absolutely the most contentious little piece of property on the whole planet. And it doesn't really make sense unless you understand what's been going on throughout history since these covenants have been made. Ever since the Lord promised Satan that he was going to crush his head. And so that's what we're talking about, okay? And so the big question is, all right, the return of Jesus in this rapture, okay? So we're going to look at the most classic rapture passage, which is in 1 Thessalonians 4. And this is the one that everybody universally agrees on, no matter what camp you're in, that this is the rapture event, okay? And it says, starting in verse 13, we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, concerning those who are asleep, so that you will not grieve like the rest who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, in the same way, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. For we say this to you by a word from the Lord. We who are still alive at the Lord's coming will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the archangel's voice, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are still alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will always be with the Lord. Therefore encourage one another with these words. All right, so that's it. So what we have is actually three things, okay? We have the resurrection of the righteous dead. We have the translation of the living saints, where we go from this body into a glorified body. And then we have the second coming of Jesus. Okay, those are all happening in the same event. I think the reason that the rapture gets highlighted amongst those three things so much is because we're all hopeful that we'll be alive when that day comes, I think. And so, you know, it would be exciting to be here one day and then to be caught up, right? But so much emphasis gets placed on the living at the time of this event that we don't ask enough questions sometimes about, well, what about the dead that are raised? Who does that include? Who does that not include? And what does that look like? And, you know, Jesus is coming. Does he come twice, or does he only come once? And we have all these other passages, right? There are a lot of other passages to look at to compare and contrast. So we have some choices to make. So I'm just going to give you an overview of the basic views, okay? The first one is the most well-known. It's our Pre-Trib Rapture view. This is where, at the beginning of Daniel's 70th week, Jesus returns on the clouds at this point, and the church is raptured at the beginning of the 7 years. Okay? Tribulation, pre-tribulation, right? Makes sense? And then, while the church meets Jesus in the air, that is going to include, because we're talking about the church here, this is the dispensational theory. So the church includes believers from Pentecost to this event, okay? It's just this group of people. It doesn't include anybody before. None of the Old Testament saints. So the church is resurrected and translated and caught up. The marriage supper of the Lamb will take place in heaven during the 7-year period while God's wrath is being poured out on the earth. We're going to look at, well, I'll get to the end of it real quick. So then we stay up in heaven. For the 7-year period, right? And then at the end, when it's time for the Armageddon battle, Jesus returns in his post-tribulation, post-second coming. All right, everybody acknowledges that the second coming of Jesus is post-tribulation, right? But the dispute here is it in two phases? Right? Does he come down on the clouds and then take everybody back to heaven for the tribulation? Or does he just come at the end? So in this view, just the church is resurrected and raptured, taken to heaven. Now, we have the basic framework of it, okay? And then we move on into the millennium, right? And the kingdom is established. So here's some issues that we have to address, that every theory has to address. Okay? The first one is imminence versus expectancy. One of the big arguments for the pre-trib position is this idea of imminence. The idea that we can't know when this is going to happen. Therefore, there can't be any precursors that might tip us off, right? What are some of the lines that you know that are used to support that? What are the phrases? He'll come like a
thief.
A thief
In the night.
He comes like a thief in the night. Okay. And then the other line is no one knows the day or the hour. Okay. And so they take those two statements, and we're going to look at those a little further, but they take those two statements and they say, hey, nobody can know when this is going to happen. So even like this covenant right here, if that happens, then this idea of imminency is no longer valid, right? And there's an upside to this idea of imminency. I mean, if we thought that the return of Jesus and the rapture could happen at any second, before this class is over, it keeps that pressure on us as believers to live righteously and to evangelize and all of these great things. Okay? And Jesus tells us all the time, watch, and so I think that some of that is good and well-intentioned. And we'll move on to the next issue, is the first resurrection. Okay. So we learned in our millennialisms last week that the first resurrection takes place after the Antichrist is, or right there at the end of the tribulation period, and then the Antichrist is thrown into the lake of fire. And so we have this first resurrection, according to Revelation 20, takes place here. But we know that the church is being resurrected here. And so the idea is that, well, the first resurrection is a general term. The first resurrection is for the righteous. And so it's going to come in different phases. Just like Jesus was the first one, the firstborn of the dead, the first to be raised from the dead. That happened 2,000 years ago. So what's the big deal if some of the righteous are resurrected here, and then 7 years later the rest of the righteous are resurrected? It's all part of the first resurrection. And that's the viewpoint there. Then we have the marriage supper of the Lamb. The question with this is, does this take place on heaven, or in heaven, or does this take place on earth? Because it's argued both ways. And so in this viewpoint, it takes place in heaven, right? And then who's included in this, right? Because if just the church has been resurrected and raptured, just the church is taking part in the marriage supper of the Lamb. So then what about all the Old Testament saints? How are they not part of it? And so those are the questions that arise. Back to that first resurrection, this also draws some other questions about, all right, well, if just the church is resurrected here, right, then what about the Old Testament saints? When are they resurrected? Are they resurrected at the end, right? There's also tribulation saints, right? We see followers of Jesus, and they're supposed to come to faith after the resurrection, or the rapture, maybe because of the rapture, right? And so they come to faith, but they got to endure the tribulation. What happens with them? They don't get resurrected because there's not a translation if they survive, so then they have to enter the kingdom as mortals. And so really, we start running into some interesting issues, Yes, Keith?
So I know one of the theories on pre-trib for the Old Testament is using the passage that Christ led captivity captive. Abraham's bosom is no more. All Old Testament saints followed him into glory in heaven at that point.
So we have, and it's my understanding that if you've died and you're a believer, right, whether it was before the cross or after, you're with Christ, you're in heaven. And so it's interesting, just think about this, when this let's talk about this resurrection, okay? Let's talk about it from the perspective of somebody who's already passed in glory, okay? So your body is down here, buried somewhere, presumably, but your spirit is up here, right? So it's interesting, it says that he'll come with the saints, but then it also says the saints will be raised from the dead. And you're like, well, how does that work? Are they coming with him, or are they being raised? Well, it's kind of both, right? Because their bodies are being raised in glory, but their spirits are coming with Jesus from heaven. And so you can kind of look at it both ways, right? But this is kind of, it's been argued one side, it's kind of two sides of the same coin. And so they'll emphasize the argument, well, he comes with in the return at the end, but not at the beginning, and vice versa. So yeah, so this is one of those issues that you just have to kind of continue to look at. And my encouragement is as you're trying to divide this out, dispensationalism did everybody a great service by recognizing Israel's place in God's economy, right? They're very serious about that. But this theory came to be because of this issue right here. Because dispensationalism has theorized that the church is its own entity and it's separate from all the other groups in Bible history of believers. They've created a problem that the pre-trib rapture was actually solves that problem for them. Because it allows God to work on Israel, on the earth, while the church is in heaven. And so we're going back to this classic dispensational theory where the church is God's heavenly people, remember that? And Israel is God's earthly people. And so right now we're in the church age, and God is working and moving his gospel through the church. But then the church is going to be removed, and he's going to once again put his focus on Israel, and he's going to work and move through Israel to bring the gospel to the world. That's how the system works. And so since God in dispensational, especially the classic traditional theory, isn't going to work through two different groups at the same time, we have to get the church out of here, okay? And so the reality is that when dispensational rose to prominence about 1850, this came with it, okay? You'll find no arguments or discussions of a pre-tribulational rapture before about 1850, okay? So that means for 1850 years, the church believes something else, okay? The last issue, two more. The wrath of Satan versus the wrath of God. This is another thing that we have to take a look at. It says that the church is not destined for wrath, right? That's one of our statements in Thessalonians, and that's a big statement for this system because they interpret the entirety of Daniel's 70th week as the wrath of God, from the four seals, the four horsemen, all the way through the bowl judgments at the end. And so since we're not subject to wrath, we can't be here. So obviously the rapture needs to take place before the 70th week begins. Okay? But is this period in here really God's wrath? Or is this God's wrath where Satan is persecuting the church in Israel, right? So these are the things that we have to look at in the text itself, and it gives us plenty of clues. And then the last issue is the Day of the Lord. Now, the Day of the Lord is not a New Testament topic. It started way back in the Old Testament, and you can just search it, and you're going to get tons of references all through Isaiah and Ezekiel. All the minor prophets, like particularly Joel and Amos. It's just mentioned over and over, and so many details are given about it. But the Day of the Lord is the Old Testament description, just to make a long story short, of the second coming. Okay, and the Day of the Lord includes three particular features, and that is wrath. Right? It's a day of clouds and thick darkness, is described in Joel, where God's enemies are going to be punished. They're going to cry out for the rocks to fall on top of them. This is quoted in Revelation. It's going to be a day of vengeance, in particular for Israel, God's beloved people, right? And this goes back into that covenant. If you bless them, you'll be blessed, but if you curse them, you will be cursed, right? And so Israel's enemies, and you see the time of Jacob's trouble, right, is all about the surrounding nations coming against Israel. And so God's going to come and he's going to judge the surrounding nations. It's the same geographical area that's been persecuting Israel all throughout history, ever since they became a people. But also included in descriptions of the Day of the Lord is a day of salvation. Okay? So the Day of the Lord includes Israel's salvation. And we know from later passages it also includes the vindication, the rescue, the salvation of the followers of Jesus. Okay? And so we have three aspects here of vengeance and wrath and salvation, all taking place at the day of the Lord. And so we have some important statements about the day of the Lord that we'll get into with a couple of these other theories. But for this one, I'll just say that the pre-trib theory just says, you know what, this whole period right here, that 7-year period is the day of the Lord. Now I think everybody acknowledges that the day of the Lord is not just one day, it's definitely a period of time. But when does it start is the key issue, okay? Does it start here sometime before a covenant is made with the Antichrist, or does it start after any specific event, okay? All right, so any questions on kind of the general view of the pre-trib theory? I think you guys are pretty familiar with it, but this is the basic structure. Is there anything in it that you didn't really know before, or is kind of surprising to you about it, or you want to ask about? Yes?
Yeah, I never realized that they were saying that those who would be raptured are just from the cross to the covenant.
Yeah.
I was thinking that they meant everybody who was righteous prior.
No, and that is the key driver of why this theory exists. Absolutely. Yeah, you have to get the church out of the program so that God can continue to put his focus back on Israel. Yeah. So
They use the 2 Thessalonians 1 through 12 in that section where it says the day of the Lord cannot come till he who restrains is removed.
yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, because when we get into the next ones, we're gonna cover some of those verses. So yeah. Anybody else? Anything on it? All right. So we're gonna move on from the pre-trib, and then we're gonna go to what is known as mid-trib. Okay. And so mid-trib is just a modification of the pre-trib theory. Okay. And it's because of a verse in 2 Thessalonians. If you go to 2 Thessalonians 2, and we're looking at verses 2 through 4. It says, "Do not be easily upset or troubled, either by a prophecy or a message or by a letter supposedly from us, alleging that the day of the Lord has come. Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction," aka the Antichrist. And so Paul says, hey, the day of the Lord can't happen unless we have the Antichrist being revealed, but this is the abomination of desolation, and then the apostasy that is produced from the persecution of the Antichrist that comes after that, okay? And so, well, the Antichrist has to be revealed, and he will be revealed at this point. And so they say, okay, we're still going to rapture the church, okay? Except the church age is going to extend to this point, and when that happens, then we have the rapture, okay? Basically the exact same program as the pre-trib theory, except what they've done is they said, okay, as far as the imminence argument, they give up on the imminence. So people who are mid-trib will say, yeah, imminence or expectancy, they say, no, we're on the side of expectancy. We expect that this could happen at any time. We're looking for it, but we're looking for these specific things so that we will know, okay? And these specific things are the Antichrist walking into the temple, declaring himself to be God, and desecrating the temple in Jerusalem, thereby revealing himself and then unleashing his persecution and his war on Israel, okay? At that point, it's theorized that Jesus returns, raptures the church, resurrects the church, and goes to heaven. Oh, I forgot something. Forgive me. Okay. And this is part of both of these theories. The pre-trib and the mid-trib when Jesus returns on the clouds, trumpet, shout of the archangel, resurrection of the dead, translation of the living into glory to meet him in the clouds, it's secret. It's invisible. If you're not a believer, you won't know it happened except the person next to you disappeared. Okay? This was popularized in the Left Behind series, right? Now, this is the reason, there's a reason that, because it doesn't say that in the text, okay? It doesn't say that this isn't visible for everybody to see. But there's a word in the text, it's a key word, it's called the parousia or parousia in Greek. I don't want to get into Greek. But the idea of this visible return where he comes all the way down and he keeps coming down, right? They're saying that this pre-trib rapture or mid-trib rapture is not that. But since that is clearly visible for all the world to see, this can't, because there can only be one of those. And so they came up with this idea that, well, it's a secret, nobody will see it. So Jesus isn't really returning as far as everybody else knows. Okay? Only the church will know. And again, just the church. Okay? And so this is another element that some people don't realize. They read the text and they're like, oh, it sounds really cool. Wait till the world sees that. Well, the world's not going to see it according to these theories. I forgot to mention that. Forgive me. Okay, so basically the same program, address the issues the same way. The only change is the expectancy issue. And they say, well, we can know generally about when it's going to take place because we're going to see the Antichrist revealed in this Great Apostasy because of persecution. All right, that is not a very popular view. I don't really know anybody that prescribes to that per se. Pre-trib, wildly popular. And I don't know, honestly, I don't know if a lot of people who prescribe to the pre-trib really know all the details about it, the fine details and how it came about, but that's why this class is here. And if that's your position, that's great. It's a very well reasoned and argued position. Okay, I'm not here to get into a big debate about that. We're just presenting theories. So next up, we're going to discuss the post-trib rapture. And this is the non-dispensational view, which means that non-dispensationalists look at believers as one big group of people. Either you're a believer or you're not, right? Either you believed in the promises of God and in the promised one, who are one and the same, or you don't, okay? And so the way they see it, and this is actually probably the most natural reading of this topic in the Bible, is to understand it this way. You have to do a lot of explaining and tweaking and inferring to get to those previous two theories. That doesn't mean that they're totally, that maybe they're not right, but this seems a little more straightforward. And you're looking at the second coming passages, and the first resurrection and the rapture is all one same event taking place right here at the end of the tribulation with the visible return of Jesus on the clouds. And so let's look at that some passages that put the tribulation at the end, or put the resurrection, rapture, and tribulation, and second coming at the end. The biggest one is going to be right out of the Olivet Discourse. Jesus' longest sermon on the end times is in Matthew 24. It's also recorded in a couple of the other Gospels, but Matthew 24 is really the quintessential one. And so if we go to Matthew 24, we're going to see some things that have led people, this was kind of, I'll say this, amillennialism was kind of the predominant view, really, until premillennialism and dispensationalism came back on the scene. But there was always premillennial writings throughout those 1850 years. And those premillennialists took this viewpoint of the post-tribulation rapture because they didn't see that. They agreed with the amillennialists that the church and Israel were united, but they didn't agree that the church replaced Israel in some way. Okay? So let's look at let's look at some of this chapter. It says in verse 15, this is Jesus speaking, it says, "When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place," let the reader understand, "then let those in Judea must flee to the mountains. The man on the housetop must not come down to get his things out of his house. The man in the field must not go back to get his coat. Woe to pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days. Pray that your escape will not be on the Sabbath. For at that time there will be great distress, the kind that has not taken place from the beginning of the world until now and never will again." So what's he describing here? Great tribulation, right? The last 3.5 years. And then it says, "Unless those days were cut short, no one would be saved. Those days will be cut short because of the elect." We're going to talk about that verse in a little bit. False messiahs, false prophets are going to lead people astray, if possible, even the elect. And so it says this, "For as lightning comes from the east and flashes as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man." That's a reference to Daniel 7. Jesus referred to himself as the Son of Man 78 times in the Gospels. He only referred to himself as the Son of God less than 10 times. The Messiah also less than 10 times. But he overwhelmingly preferred the phrase Son of Man for himself. Because he was identifying himself with the Son of Man in Daniel chapter 7. And we see in Daniel chapter 7, the Son of Man comes on the clouds, is presented before God on the throne, is given an everlasting kingdom, he kills the Antichrist, and so this is where Jesus is drawing from. So this is the key verse, verse 29. It says, "Immediately after the distress of those days." So he's talking about immediately after the tribulation. "The sun will be darkened and the moon will not shed its light." That's one of the key indicators of the beginning of the day of the Lord. "The stars will fall from the sky and the powers of the heavens will be shaken." Remember, there's going to be a great war in heaven, and Satan will be thrown down to the earth, right? "And then all the peoples of the earth, the Son of Man will appear in the sky and coming on the clouds, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." And so this is his visible return, right, at the end of the tribulation. And it says he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet. They will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Isn't that interesting? That sounds a whole lot like our passage in 1 Thessalonians 4, doesn't it? You've got the archangel, the trumpet, coming on the clouds, gathering the elect in the sky, right, and these things. And so this is probably the biggest argument that you'll see when it comes to those who are proponents of this post-trib theory, is that Paul is just simply drawing from Matthew 24 when he's instructing the Thessalonians. Okay? And so let's get into some of those issues as far as imminence and expectancy. Okay? So this obviously would be a position that prefers expectancy. We're expecting the Antichrist to come. We're expecting the Great Tribulation. We're expecting signs and wonders and all these things. And we're also expecting the return of Jesus to rescue us out of this, right? So, the thief in the night, 1 Thessalonians 5. Okay? Let's look at this, and I'm not going to get into a huge defense, but we're just going to look at the passages and see what they actually say so that we're being clear about it. So 1 Thessalonians 5, it says, "About the times and seasons, brothers and sisters, you do not need anything to be written to you." Okay, and this is kind of taken like, hey, you should know when this stuff's going to happen because I've told you what's going to happen before. "For you yourselves know very well that the day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night." Okay, the issue is here, who's going to be surprised by this? Okay? "When they say peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them, like labor pains on a pregnant woman, and they will not escape." Who does that sound like? The righteous or the unrighteous? The unrighteous, yeah? So the unrighteous are going to be surprised by the return of Jesus in the day of the Lord. They're not going to anticipate this, right? Scoffers will come in the last days. And they'll say, where's the return? Where's the promise of his coming? Everything's continuing on just like it has, right? Since our fathers fell asleep. This is quoted by Paul and Peter. And this is the idea that the church is going to be on earth, and even Israel, who is believing, and they're going to be saying, Jesus is coming, Jesus is coming. Look at all this stuff that is happening to the earth. And everybody's going to be going, no, everything's fine. Everything's not fine. And then Jesus comes and catches them all by surprise. Okay? So what about the believers? But you, brothers and sisters, and he's talking to the church here, right? So take that for what it's worth. Are not in the dark for this day to surprise you like a thief. Are the believers going to be surprised when Jesus returns? No. Okay, so this verse that it gets pulled up here, that you know very well that the day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night. That's right. That's very true. But keep reading. Okay, we're not in the darkness for that day to take us by surprise. Okay? We will be very aware of what's going on, and that's why this was all revealed to us, according to the post-trib period. All right. No one knows the day or the hour. Back to Matthew 24. So it's really interesting. We just read in Matthew 24 of the post-tribulation return of Jesus, right? And he talks about gathering the saints, right? And then we get down to verse 36. Now concerning that day and hour, no one knows, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, except the Father alone. What day and hour is he talking about? This one that he just explained at the end of the tribulation when he returns, right? He says, no one knows the exact day or hour. Not even I know when this is going to happen. Oh, well, how can that be, right? Because if all this has just happened, then we should be able to figure out when he's coming back. So, like, what's the deal here? Well, think about it from Paul's perspective. Paul thought, he's writing to the Thessalonians in the first century, and he sees the persecution that's going on in his day. He thinks, well, this could be coming any year here, right? It's all shaping up. And granted, the temple was still in Jerusalem, so there's a possibility, right? But he didn't know, right? He couldn't know. Couldn't know that there was going to be 2,000 years. And it even says that these days in here, the time of Jacob's trouble, right, will be cut short for the sake of the elect. So it's going to be a little bit of a surprise, right? Because we know that this period is 42 months and 1,260 days and 3.5 years, all those things, right? But we don't know the exact day or the hour. He says, I'm going to come in a time that you don't expect, and he's talking to the church. And so it says these days are going to be cut short. And so this is the idea that, you know, when the peak of Satan's wrath and his persecution of Israel and the church are going, and it looks like nobody's going to survive, and we're counting down the days, this is going to happen slightly before. There's going to be some reprieve. Because we'll see, we have to make room for the wrath to be poured out. Okay? Because we'll get into this later, but the idea is that when the wrath of God is poured out, that's at the day of the Lord, right? So, the day of the Lord includes this darkening of the sun, right? Think about this. You guys go to a movie theater, right, or any sort of a show, and what happens? The lights are on, everybody's hanging out, we're talking, peace and safety, everything's good, right? But then all of a sudden, the lights get dim. Everybody kind of gets quiet, okay? And then, everybody sits down, and the curtain is pulled back, right? And then the brightness of the show comes on the screen. Where do you think movie theaters and theaters got the idea for that progression of starting a show? This is like, step for step, the return of Jesus, right? The sun and moon are darkened. The skies roll back as a scroll, and then he bursts forth in flaming fire with all of his holy angels, right? I mean, it's pretty cool. I can't wait to see it. And the cool part is that one way or another, we're going to see that. So, anyway. But the point is that the wrath of God gets poured out after that, right? We have a war with the Antichrist. We have bowl judgments poured out on the Antichrist and his kingdom. And so this idea of the post-trib rapture happens before the wrath of God is poured out. And so it is very much in line with Paul's statement that we're not destined for wrath. But it's a little bit different then this last theory that we're going to cover here, which is much newer and is called the Pre-Wrath Rapture. And again, we don't have time to get into much more of the details of the post-trib, but again, there's some resources there. But I want to take some time to look at this pre-wrath, okay? The pre-wrath theory is interesting because the progressive dispensationalists who believe that the church is going to return with Jesus are gravitating towards this pre-wrath theory. And the idea is still that it's different from post-trib. The timing is kind of similar in that Jesus returns at the end of the tribulation, but before the wrath is poured out. But where it differs is it's still the church being raptured. And so this is still kind of a dispensationalist view. But it's a very big break from this pre-trib theory, right? So the classic dispensationalists, going back to the late 1800s and early 1900s, are here. The more modern dispensationalists, and it's not a huge group, but it is a pretty big contention, are moving towards this pre-wrath theory. And so this is the difference between pre-wrath and post-trib. This is the key right here, is that in post-trib, Jesus comes down, he gathers the saints in the clouds, and then comes all the way down, right? This is the second coming. This is his return. The saints are gathered to greet him in the air, almost like when somebody shows up to your house and you come to the door, right? That's the word that is used. It's actually even more than that. Like when a dignitary arrived to a city, they would come out to the edge of town and greet the person, the dignitary that's arriving, and then escort them back into the town. So when it says we'll meet the Lord in the air, that specific word meet is the one that Paul uses to describe that type of idea where we're going up into the clouds to meet and greet and escort Jesus back to earth. And so that's the post-trib position. What happens in pre-wrath, and so basically while the wrath of God is being poured out with all those bowl judgments and things, we're there and we're with Jesus and we're protected during that time. Almost like in Egypt, right? When the plagues were being poured out on the Egyptians, where was Israel? They were in Goshen. What happened when there was darkness over all the land? There was light in Goshen, right? What happens when all the firstborn were killed, right? Blood on the doorposts, and all of the Israelites' children were saved, right? And so they weren't removed from the situation, they were just kept and sheltered in place. And this is the idea with post-trib, is that Jesus is going to gather us, we're going to come down, he's going to start unleashing his wrath as we make this progression to Jerusalem for this final battle. What pre-wrath does is it says, okay, Jesus is going to come down, post-trib, right? So we're kind of agreeing with all of that. And the saints are going to meet him in the air. And then we're all going to go back to heaven. And the wrath of God is going to be poured out on the Antichrist and his kingdom. And then we come down at a later period. Okay? And so it's kind of a it seems like a small distinction. Well, you know, are we on earth while the wrath of God is being poured out with Jesus, or do we go back to heaven with Jesus while the wrath is being poured out? And again, really, it comes back to the dispensational issue versus the non-dispensational issue. It comes down to the groups of people and their divisions and how they're divided, right? And so this is much, much closer to post-trib. They're agreeing with a lot of the issues about the timing, but it's different in the sense that the church is still taken to heaven for a period of time while wrath is poured out, versus just coming down to earth while wrath is poured out. So I'm going to just run through real quick these last couple of things on our interpretation issues, so I don't miss too much. I gave you a list of passages that are kind of good to look at and be familiar with, just in general. We talked about the imminence versus expectancy. We talked about the first resurrection. Okay, so in these post-trib views, the first resurrection is just one big resurrection of the saints. The marriage supper of the Lamb, okay, in post-trib it takes place on earth. Jesus establishes his kingdom and sits on his throne in Jerusalem. All the resurrected saints and Israel is restored, and there's a great banquet, the marriage supper of the Lamb of God's people, Jews and Gentiles, right? Or is it in heaven with the church while God's pouring out his wrath on Israel? That's kind of the divide there. And then we talked about the wrath of Satan versus the wrath of God. Here's some things, some time markers on the day of the Lord. It says, the moon turns to blood and the sun turns to darkness before the day of the Lord. Joel 2:31. You know that happens at the end of the tribulation. Elijah comes before the day of the Lord. Now, Pre-Trib says that John the Baptist fulfilled that promise. Okay? But Jesus says, well, Elijah does come, and this is after John's dead. So it can also be looked at as Jesus is affirming Malachi's prophecy. This is Malachi 4:5, that Elijah will come before the day of the Lord. Elijah has traditionally been supposed to be one of the two witnesses that witness in Jerusalem for the second half of the tribulation. Okay? I remember Elijah was taken up. He never died, just like Enoch was taken up. So does Elijah come or not, right? But either way, it's before the day of the Lord. Believers won't be surprised. We covered that. Relief for the church and vengeance on those afflicting the church at the same time. Okay, so this is out of 2 Thessalonians 1, but we see that in that description of Jesus' return, this is why a lot of pre-trib will say this isn't a description of the rapture, this is actually a description of the second coming, because they acknowledge that this is Jesus coming, and at the same time as granting relief to the church, he's also inflicting judgment on the church's enemies. Okay? So if those things are happening at the same time, that's got to be at the end, right? So this is kind of delayed relief 7 years later, because if God was inflicting judgment on his enemies when he returned here, well, we wouldn't have the tribulation, would we? Okay. And then the other issue we already covered is the apostasy, the Antichrist, and the Abomination all come before the day of the Lord. And so those are kind of the key issues. I hope that that was a good, interesting overview of these things. I hope it perks your interest to look into them more. Again, there's some resources there if you're interested in some of those other ideas. So practical eschatology. The phrase has been out there, you know, I don't want to get in a big argument about this, but let's just hope for the best, right? And we'll plan for the worst. Or, you know, I'm pan-trib, you know, I trust God, everything's going to pan out, right? But in all seriousness, if the church is going to go through this period of time, what does preparing for this even begin to look like? Right? I think it was easy for the church in the first century because they were being persecuted. Right? They saw Rome as, you know, the Antichrist empire, and they thought that Caesar could have been the Antichrist, and, you know, they were like, this might be it, I don't know. You know, Nero Caesar, any way you shape it, you take the numbers of his name in Roman and add them up, it adds to 666. So there were a lot of reasons that the believers in the first century thought that, you know, maybe this is it, Jesus is coming back. It wasn't, right? But the reality is we can learn a lot from them and how they lived in that time period, because they were preparing, or they thought they were kind of in the midst of some of this persecution. And so you can read in Paul's epistles, you know, he gives advice to the churches in the midst of persecution on some of these things. But for us, I mean, what does that look like? How do we prepare for that? Things that we just should think about, right? And then, Paul thought that this could happen in his own generation, and most of Paul's admonitions and his instructions, he draws on Jesus a lot. And so Jesus has a lot to say about this as well. And Paul is just kind of reiterating the things that Jesus was saying. You know, Paul, the idea of the Great Apostasy comes from Jesus' sermon on the Olivet Discourse. And this great tribulation comes, and many will fall away, right? And brother will hate brother, and son will turn on his father. These are all issues that will happen. So anyway, we got through the rapture, right? Nobody's yelling at each other, nobody's upset. That's good, that's a victory. So what's next? All right, so we've discussed the seed of the woman. We're talking about Jesus here. But what about the seed of the serpent? I'm referring again to that prophecy back in Genesis 3:15. Okay? We've been talking about one side of this whole battle, but what about the seed of the serpent? This story of redemption isn't just about God and mankind. So next week, we're going to turn to Satan, his children, his heir, the Antichrist. And we're going to start to look at who he is, where he comes from, what his kingdom looks like, the extent of his kingdom, and things like that. So thanks for coming, and see you next week.